I'm Casey Thompson, 28 years old. You might be wondering what makes me different, why I'm standing here telling you my story. Let me answer that for you, because for as long as I can remember, I've been living in my brother Nate's shadow. Growing up in the Thompson family meant one thing: everything had to be perfect. Nate was the firstborn, always in the spotlight, always the one who everyone thought had it all figured out. And me, I was the other one. The one who was constantly overlooked, constantly fighting for a seat at the table, and somehow always falling short. I'd worked hard for my law degree, built my own life, far from the expectations of my family. But it never mattered. To them, Nate was the future of Thompson Enterprises, the empire built by our grandfather, George Thompson. He was the heir. I was the afterthought. But everything changed when I got the invitation. The letter arrived one morning, embossed with the Thompson family seal. It was an official summons to a family financial meeting at Thompson Manor, our estate in Santa Barbara, a place I'd avoided for years, not because of the memories, but because it was always a reminder of the divide between me and the rest of my family. I looked at the letter, my heart beating faster with a strange mix of dread and hope. For once, this wasn't just another gathering where I'd be a silent observer. For once, it felt like something important, something that could change everything. It wasn't just an invitation to a meeting. It was an invitation to step into the role I was never meant to have. So, what did I do? I accepted. But as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting might reveal more than I was prepared for. Before we dive deeper, let me ask you this. Have you ever felt like you were just the second choice in someone's eyes? If that resonates with you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, this story is only getting started, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Stay tuned, because things are about to get intense. Growing up in the Thompson family was anything but ordinary. We lived in a mansion that could rival any Hollywood estate, with sprawling grounds that stretched for miles. Thompson Manor was a symbol of everything my father, Richard Thompson, had worked for: wealth, success, and a name that meant power. The estate overlooked the Pacific Ocean, and I was just another person wandering its halls, trying to find my place. My brother Nate, on the other hand, was the natural heir to it all. He had been groomed from a young age to take over Thompson Enterprises, our family's multi-billion-dollar tech empire. He was the golden boy, the one everyone praised, the one everyone thought would be the future of the company. And I was the quiet one, the one who excelled in my own right but was always dismissed by my parents, never fully seen. I remember when I graduated law school. I was the top of my class, a rare achievement in a family that always praised Nate for his corporate triumphs. My parents didn't even show up to my graduation. Instead, they flew across the country to attend a charity gala where Nate was being honored for his latest business deal. When I won a case that got a lot of attention, my father sent me a quick text saying, "Well done, Casey. But Nate's got a meeting with the board later, so you know how it is." It was always the same. Nate was the one who got the praise, the one who was destined for greatness. Meanwhile, I was carving my own path, fighting for every inch, but it never felt like enough. I was the second choice, the one who had to prove herself on her own terms. And then there was Grandpa George. He was different. He wasn't like my parents. He didn't care about wealth or status. He'd built his empire from nothing, starting as a small-town lawyer before creating the tech giant that would become Thompson Enterprises. Grandpa George always saw something in me. When everyone else overlooked me, he noticed. He'd sit with me for hours, talking about the importance of integrity, of doing what's right even when it's hard. "Casey," he would say, "your strength isn't in what you inherit, but in what you create with your own hands. That's what will matter most." Those words stayed with me, even as I felt lost in the shadow of my family. While Nate was already positioned to take over the family business, I was quietly building a life of my own, away from the family name. I worked at a small law firm that focused on civil rights, helping people who couldn't afford high-priced lawyers. I wasn't chasing the family fortune. I was chasing something else, something I thought was mine, something I could call my own. But then the call came. Grandpa George's lawyer, Mr. Green, said, "Mr. Thompson requests your presence this weekend at Thompson Manor. It's about family financial matters. Everyone will be there." I tried not to get my hopes up. The last family gathering had been filled with tension. Nate had monopolized the conversation, bragging about his latest business deals, while my parents showered him with praise. It had been unbearable, and I left early, pretending I had work to do. But this time, I couldn't pretend. Grandpa George had been ill recently, and although he rarely talked about it, I knew something was wrong. The gossip was everywhere. His health was declining, and I couldn't bear the thought of missing this chance to see him, to understand what was really going on. So, I packed my bags and made my way to Thompson Manor. The drive felt endless, my thoughts racing. Would this be just another round of Nate's spotlight and my quiet dismissal, or was something finally going to shift? Was this the moment I'd been waiting for? I had no idea. All I knew was that my family's expectations, the weight of their legacy, was about to collide with my own vision, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what that would bring. But one thing was for sure. After this weekend, nothing would be the same. Thompson Manor slowly came into view as I turned down the long gravel drive. The grand columns of the house loomed over me, casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. It looked just like I remembered, majestic, imposing, and cold. A house built on expectations, but none of them were mine. As I approached the front door, the weight of everything that had brought me here settled heavily on my shoulders. Jackson, the estate manager who'd worked for our family for decades, was waiting by the door as usual, his face a mask of warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Miss Casey," he said, stepping forward to open the door. "Your grandfather will be pleased you've arrived." His smile was kind, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He'd always been there, in the background, observing the family dynamics with a quiet, knowing gaze. He'd seen my parents put Nate on a pedestal his whole life, while I was left to figure out how to make my own mark. And yet, despite all the years of watching, all the years of loyalty to our family, Jackson knew better than anyone that, when it came to matters of the Thompsons, nothing was as simple as it seemed. I stepped out of the car, trying not to let the chill in the air freeze me in place. The gravel crunched beneath my feet, a sound that seemed too loud in the silence around me. As I walked through the massive front door, I was greeted by the usual mix of family members: cousins, aunts, uncles, all milling about with forced smiles. None of them ever looked at me like they really saw me, just another piece of furniture in the grand house, like something that was supposed to be there but wasn't really noticed unless it was time to redecorate. I glanced up to the staircase, just in time to see Nate coming down with that arrogant smile of his. He was the golden boy, after all. Perfectly tailored suit, the same calculated charm that made him the family's prized possession. "Well, look who finally showed up," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, like he had better things to do than acknowledge my existence. "Nice to see you too, Nate," I said, forcing a smile as I stood there, trying not to let his smug expression get under my skin. "How's the big deal going?" "Oh, business as usual. Nothing I can't handle," he said, his tone smug as ever. As usual, everything was about him, every word, every gesture, every look. Nate had this way of walking into a room and making sure everyone knew he was in charge. And I was always the second choice, the one who wasn't supposed to be in charge. It was always the same. While Nate took all the praise for things he barely even worked for, I did the work that nobody cared about. But today, I wasn't here to play the victim. I wasn't here to shrink into the background, not anymore. This weekend, things were going to change. Just as I was about to turn away, I heard my mother's voice. "Casey, darling, welcome home," she said, offering me a quick kiss on the cheek that felt more like a formality than a warm greeting. I could feel the invisible wall between us growing taller every time she spoke. "How are you? How's work?" Her eyes didn't even meet mine. Instead, they flicked to Nate, who was already deep in conversation with my father, Richard, the ever-present CEO of Thompson Enterprises. "Good, Mom, busy, but good," I replied, keeping my voice steady, even though the words tasted bitter coming out. "And you?" "Oh, you know how it is," she said, her voice trailing off as she moved to join the conversation with Richard and Nate. My father barely acknowledged me, his focus already shifting to whatever Nate had to say. As always, I was invisible. It wasn't that I hadn't worked hard enough. It wasn't that I hadn't proven myself. I had. But in my family, nothing was ever enough unless it was done in Nate's shadow. And so, I had learned to do what I always did. Stay quiet, observe, and wait for the moment to come when I would finally be seen. Dinner came, and the family gathered around the long mahogany table. The air was thick with the usual pleasantries, but there was an underlying tension I couldn't ignore. Nate dominated the conversation, of course, regaling everyone with tales of his latest corporate successes. My father beamed with pride, his eyes never leaving Nate. My mother was too busy adjusting her jewelry to pay attention to anything outside of her perfect little world. But me, I was just there. An afterthought, a silent participant in a family drama that was unfolding without me. Every word Nate spoke only reminded me of how far I had to go to prove myself. Wilson Enterprises just closed a major deal with Denning Systems, my father said, looking over at Nate. Great work, son. This is the kind of leadership we need to take us to the next level. Nate shrugged, the modesty clearly practiced. It was nothing, really, just applied what you taught me. And just like that, it was back to him. Back to the golden child, the one who had it all, the one who could do no wrong. My mother glanced my way only once, asking about my latest project, as if she were vaguely interested. I sighed, excusing myself from the table. I needed a moment to breathe. Walking out into the gardens, I was relieved to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the dining room. The cool night air hit me like a slap, and I walked aimlessly through the garden, letting the silence settle over me. I needed to think. To focus, what was this meeting really about? What was Grandpa planning to do? As I passed the library, I overheard my father's voice, low and tense. "It's done, Stanford. We're announcing it tomorrow." "Are you sure?" My uncle asked, voice wavering. "What about Casey?" My father scoffed. "She's always been the second choice. She doesn't deserve the same consideration as Nate." The words cut deeper than I expected. They were always like this, weren't they? Dismissing me as if I didn't matter. But this time I was ready to make them see me, to make Grandpa see me. The next morning came too quickly. I didn't sleep much the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my family, my parents, Nate, talking about me behind my back, dismissing me like I didn't exist. It wasn't new, but somehow it hurt more than usual. This time, I knew something was coming. This time, I wasn't going to let it slide. The morning sun cast long shadows across the property as I dressed in a simple but elegant navy dress. I needed to appear calm, collected, professional. But beneath the polished exterior, my heart was pounding. This was it, the moment that would change everything, or destroy me in the process. I wasn't sure which. The family had gathered in the study, a room lined with dark wood shelves filled with legal books and family heirlooms. The table was set for a formal presentation, something that felt too orchestrated to be anything but a spectacle. Grandpa George was already there, positioned at the head of the table in his wheelchair, looking more frail than I'd ever seen him. But even in his weakened state, there was a fire in his eyes that no one could extinguish. The room fell silent when I entered, the only sound the soft click of my heels on the hardwood floor. I sat down next to Grandpa, my hands clenched in my lap. My parents and Nate were across from me, exchanging glances that felt too loaded with meaning. Nate's usual smirk was gone. My father's stern face was unreadable. My mother's gaze was fixed on the folder in front of her, like if she didn't look up, she could ignore everything that was happening. But I knew better. Stanford Green, Grandpa's lawyer, stood at the front of the room. He was a tall, cold man, his suit perfectly pressed, his face as impassive as the stone walls around us. "Thank you all for gathering today," he began, his voice low but clear. "We are here to discuss the future of Thompson Enterprises and the distribution of Mr. Thompson's assets." His words hung in the air, and I could feel the tension tighten. Everyone's eyes flicked to Grandpa, waiting for him to speak. Grandpa didn't disappoint. "I've watched my family for a long time," he said, his voice steady despite his frailty. "I've watched how you've all carried the legacy of Thompson Enterprises. But more importantly, I've watched how you've carried the legacy of the Thompson name. And frankly, I'm not proud of what I see." I could feel the weight of his words sinking in. My heart raced. I knew what he was getting at. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about everything that had been swept under the rug for years. "I built this company from nothing," Grandpa continued, his voice gaining strength. "I built it with integrity, with respect for the people who worked for us, and with the belief that what matters most in life isn't how much money you make, but how you treat others. And I've seen that idea eroded over time. Today, we're going to fix that." A chill ran down my spine. This was it. I could feel my hands tightening even more in my lap, my pulse quickening. Grandpa's eyes met mine, his expression softening for just a moment. "Casey," he said, his voice quieter now, "you've always had the integrity I've been looking for. You've always seen beyond the surface, beyond the money. You've built something real with your own hands. I've watched you work in the trenches, not for recognition, but because it's the right thing to do. I know you understand the true meaning of leadership." A lump formed in my throat. Was this really happening? After all these years of being overlooked, ignored, dismissed, Grandpa was finally acknowledging me. And I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was the heir to something far greater than I had ever imagined. The room fell into a stunned silence. My parents exchanged a glance, and I saw the shift in their faces. My father's expression hardened, but there was something else there, something darker. And Nate. His face was unreadable, but I could feel the tension in the air between us. He didn't speak, didn't even move, as if the very idea that Grandpa might be about to name me as his successor was too much to process. "This is a mistake," my father finally said, his voice thick with disbelief. "Casey, she doesn't have the experience to run this company. She's never even been involved in the business. She's a lawyer. A great one, sure, but not a business leader. She doesn't understand what it takes to drive this company forward." I felt the sting of his words, but I didn't flinch. I wasn't going to let him diminish me, not this time, not now. "Richard," Grandpa said sharply, his tone cutting through the air like a knife. "You've run this company for years, but you've forgotten what truly matters. It's not about how much money you can make. It's about how you lead, how you inspire. Casey gets that, you don't." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline surging through me. My father looked at Grandpa with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You can't do this," he spat. "You're giving everything to her. You're bypassing me. I've built this company. I've kept it running year after year while you've been. What, sitting back and watching? This is about more than business. This is about family. This is about me, your son." But Grandpa wasn't having it. "You've been too busy with your profits, Richard, to see what's right in front of you. Family isn't about power. It's about respect. It's about values." His eyes softened again as he turned to me. "And Casey, you've always shown those values. That's why this company is yours to lead." I felt my breath catch in my throat. Was this really happening? Was Grandpa really giving me everything? Everything I'd worked so hard for, everything I had dreamed of. And then, as if in slow motion, Grandpa reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. It wasn't a flashy gesture, just a simple white envelope with my name written in bold, elegant handwriting. My heart skipped a beat as I watched him hand it to me. "Open it," Grandpa said gently, his voice surprisingly steady. "It's time for you to take your place. This is your legacy now." I took the envelope in trembling hands, my fingers suddenly cold. I pulled it open, and inside was a check. A check for $55 million. My eyes went wide in disbelief. "This isn't real," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's very real, Casey," Grandpa said, his voice firm, yet warm. "And it's only the beginning." The room erupted in chaos. My mother jumped to her feet, face flushed with rage. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice breaking. "This is about power. You're punishing us, aren't you?" Grandpa remained calm, his voice unwavering. "No, Catherine, I'm giving this to the person who will rebuild what we've lost. This is not punishment, it's redemption." The atmosphere in Thompson Manor shifted after Grandpa George's announcement. The air seemed thicker, charged with an energy I hadn't expected. My heart raced with a mix of fear and excitement, knowing that I was standing at the precipice of something massive. But the room wasn't just still, it was bracing for impact. As we all gathered in the formal sitting room after the meeting, the tension was palpable. My father, Richard, was fuming, his face flushed with anger. Nate sat with his arms crossed, his jaw clenched tight as though trying to hold in a storm. And my mother, Catherine, stood off to the side, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, as though trying to hold back the fury that was brewing inside her. For a brief moment, I thought maybe I was dreaming. Maybe this whole thing would just fade away. But as soon as the door closed behind us, it was clear. This was real, and things were about to get ugly. "You've got to be kidding me," Richard said, his voice low but dripping with venom. He looked at Grandpa with pure disbelief. "You really think she can run this company? After all these years, you think Casey of all people, should lead this family. I braced myself. I had known this was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud still stung. My father's words felt like physical blows, sharp and cutting. He was angry, furious, even, but there was something deeper there. Something that went beyond just me. It was about control. Power. Something I had never been given a chance to hold until now. "You've lost your mind, old man," he continued, turning toward me, his voice rising. "What the hell are you thinking, Casey? You think you can just waltz in and take everything that belongs to me? You've never been part of this company. You've never cared about it. You've always been too busy with your little law career, thinking you're too good for this family." His eyes were wild, unfocused, and I could see the desperation in them. "What do you think you're going to do? Destroy everything I've worked for?" The words hit harder than I expected. A part of me wanted to shrink away, to cower under the weight of his fury. But another part of me, the one Grandpa George had believed in, was rising up. I wasn't that little girl anymore. I wasn't the afterthought, the second choice, and I wasn't going to back down. "I'm not here to destroy anything," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm here to save it, save this company from the lies and greed that have been eating away at it for years. If you think I'm just some naive outsider who doesn't know what it takes, you're wrong. I've worked harder than anyone in this family to prove that I deserve this." My chest tightened, but I pushed forward. And Grandpa George saw that. He saw my vision. He trusted me, and that's more than I can say for you. Richard's eyes narrowed, and I saw the flicker of something, guilt, maybe, or fear, in his expression. But he quickly masked it, his face turning cold and hard. "You think that because Grandpa gave you a piece of paper, you can just step into this role. This isn't about some paper, Casey. It's about the blood, sweat, and tears I've put into this company. You think you're just going to waltz in and take it all." I could see his grip tightening on the arm of his chair, his knuckles turning white. The room was thick with anger and resentment. Every word he spoke was designed to break me down, to make me feel small, insignificant, but it wasn't working anymore. I was done shrinking. I was done apologizing for who I was, for the choices I made. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you started cutting corners," I shot back, the words coming faster now. "Before you sacrificed everything that made this company great just to make a buck. Before you manipulated deals, stole ideas, and crushed anyone who stood in your way. You don't get to talk to me about blood, sweat, and tears when you've sold your soul to the highest bidder." The words hung in the air for a long moment, and I could feel the room shift. Richard looked as though he'd been slapped. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence was deafening, but it didn't last. Nate finally spoke, his voice sharp and biting. "You think this is some kind of victory, Casey? You're not going to win this. You've got no experience, no real understanding of this business. You think because Grandpa gave you a seat at the table, you're suddenly qualified to run it." His words were venom, a deep-seated resentment that I had always felt but had never been able to put into words. He was threatened, and he should have been. "I don't need to be qualified by your standards, Nate," I said, turning to him. "I don't need your approval. I have my own qualifications. I've built something real, something that means something. And I'm not here to win anything. I'm here to fix what you've broken." My voice didn't shake anymore. I could feel my confidence rising, taking over. Every word that came out felt like it was finally reaching the ears it was meant for. They were hearing me, and for the first time in my life, I knew I was being taken seriously. "You've made a lot of enemies, Nate," I continued, locking eyes with him. "And maybe it's time to start cleaning up the mess you've made. This company, this family, deserves better." A tense silence followed. No one spoke. Everyone just stared. I could feel the weight of their stares, the doubt in their eyes, but I stood tall. This was my moment. But then Grandpa George spoke. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of authority that none of us could ignore. "Enough," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "Richard, Nate, your greed and ambition have blinded you. Casey sees the bigger picture. She always has." He paused, his eyes locking with mine, softening. "And I believe she will do what's right, not just for this company, but for the people it serves." The room was still. Everything had shifted in that moment. Grandpa had just spoken, and his words held more weight than anything Richard or Nate could ever say. Richard's face went white, the blood draining from his features as the reality of what was happening sank in. Nate's jaw clenched, but there was nothing he could say to take this back. The legacy had been handed down, and it was mine now. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, his breathing labored but steady. "Casey," he said quietly, "this is your moment. Make it count." And in that moment, everything changed. The moments after Grandpa's declaration hung in the air like a dense fog. I could still feel his gaze on me, his faith in me, a faith that felt both like a blessing and a weight I wasn't sure I could bear. My heart was pounding, my palms sweating. The realization that I was now holding the reins of a legacy, a company that spanned decades, was both exhilarating and terrifying. As soon as we left the study, the mood shifted. I could feel the eyes on me, the family's gaze, heavy with a mix of disdain, confusion, and disbelief. Richard and Nate weren't even pretending to be cordial anymore. They were furious, their faces tight with anger, their eyes burning with a kind of resentment that stung deeper than any insult. But there was something else there too, fear. Fear that I was the one who now held the power. "Casey," Richard said, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "You really think you can just waltz in and take over? You don't know the first thing about business. You're not even qualified to run a lemonade stand, let alone Thompson Enterprises." His words stung. The sharpness of his voice, the venom in his tone, it was all meant to wound. But it didn't feel like it was just about the company anymore. It felt personal. He didn't just think I was unqualified, he thought I was unworthy. And that was a cut I wasn't sure I could heal from. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words got stuck in my throat. I wanted to tell him that I was capable, that I could do this. I had spent years building my own career, earning my own respect. I had never needed their approval. But the doubt, the fear, crept in. What if I could? What if this was too much for me? What if I failed? The voice inside my head that I had fought so hard to silence was rising, louder now, filling my thoughts with what-ifs and doubts. What if I'm not cut out for this? What if they're right? I could see the cracks forming in my resolve. The years of being dismissed, ignored, made to feel less than, had built a fragile foundation. Grandpa's trust in me was supposed to be the final affirmation that I was enough, but now, as I stood in the thick of this, it felt like too much. What if I lose everything? I tried to push those thoughts away. I couldn't afford to falter now. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me, suffocating, but I fought to stand tall. I wasn't just fighting for a company, I was fighting for my own identity, for a future where I was seen, for a legacy I could actually be proud of. But then Nate spoke, his voice cutting through my inner turmoil like a knife. "You think Grandpa is doing you a favor?" He stepped closer, his gaze burning with contempt. "He's setting you up to fail. You think they are going to follow you? You think the board will respect you? You're just a pity hire in their eyes, and you'll be gone before you even realize what hit you." His words were poison, but they were also a mirror. I saw the doubt in his eyes, he saw me as a threat. Not just as a sister, but as the one who might finally take what he thought was his birthright. The company, the power. And for the first time, I realized that Nate wasn't just angry at Grandpa for choosing me. He was angry because, deep down, he knew I might actually be better than him. Better at seeing the bigger picture. Better at doing things the right way. But that realization only deepened the pit in my stomach. Was I really prepared for this? For everything that would come with it? The power, the responsibility, the expectations? Or was I just fooling myself? My heart raced. My hands trembled. I could feel my breath quicken as anxiety clawed at me. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape this overwhelming pressure. I wasn't sure I was ready for any of it. And then my mother, standing to the side, finally spoke, her voice laced with that passive-aggressive calm she always wielded like a weapon. "Casey, darling, you don't have to do this," she said softly. "You can walk away. No one will think less of you. You've had your time. You've had your career. We can still help you build a future, but this is too much." Her words hit harder than anything Richard or Nate had said. Not because I didn't already know they didn't believe in me, but because it was her, my own mother, who was telling me to give up. To walk away from everything I had worked for. The only person who should have been on my side was the one who was asking me to shrink back into the shadows. "I'm not running away, Mom," I said, forcing the words out, though my throat felt tight. "I'm not going to let you or anyone else tell me what I can or can't do anymore." But even as I said it, the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. What if I couldn't do it? What if I let everyone down? "Of course you're not running away," Richard scoffed. eyes flashing with anger. "You're just jumping headfirst into something you don't understand. You'll burn this family down before you even realize what you're doing." The words were a slap in the face. He didn't see me. He didn't see the effort I had put in, the years I had sacrificed. To him, I was just a failure waiting to happen. But then Grandpa George's voice broke through, steady, calm, and filled with an authority I couldn't ignore. "Enough, Richard. Enough, all of you," he said, his gaze moving around the room. "It's time for you to see Casey. She's the one who will lead. Not because of me, but because she has the courage to make the hard decisions. And that's what this family needs." I felt the weight of his words settle over me like a heavy cloak. Grandpa had always been a man of integrity, of vision. And now, in this moment, I realized just how much he believed in me. But that belief didn't take away the fear. It didn't take away the weight of the task ahead. It only made the fear sharper. What if I couldn't live up to it? The room was silent again, but it wasn't peaceful. It was loaded with the unspoken. I knew my family wasn't going to give up easily. They would fight me, resist me, try to undermine me at every turn. And part of me wondered if I even had the strength to fight back. And then, before I could fully process what was happening, Grandpa's words landed again, his gaze never leaving me. "This is your time, Casey. Take it, or you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what could have been." It was like a switch flipped. Suddenly, all the doubt, all the fear, all the uncertainty melted away. Grandpa was right. I couldn't let this go. Not for them, not for anyone. I had to do this for me, for the legacy that I could build. A legacy of integrity, of doing things the right way, of proving that I wasn't just the second choice. "Okay," I said, my voice steady now. "I'll take it, I'll lead this company, I'll do it my way." The next few days passed in a blur, each one feeling like an eternity, the weight of the decision I'd made pressing down on me like 1,000 tons. I had taken the reins. I had accepted Grandpa's legacy, but now I wasn't sure I could carry it. It was early morning when I arrived at the office, still reeling from the previous night's events. The silence of the building felt oppressive, every shadow stretching long across the cold, marble floors. I couldn't shake the images from my mind. Richard's seething anger, Nate's quiet, simmering resentment. But it was my mother's words that lingered the most. "You don't have to do this." A part of me still wanted to believe her, to walk away and return to my comfortable life, away from the chaos and manipulation. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. I couldn't undo the decision I had made. And yet, I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to hold this all together. I sat at my desk, staring at the blank page before me. I had a meeting with the board in an hour, my first as the official trustee of Thompson Enterprises. My hands trembled as I reached for the documents Grandpa had given me. The weight of the responsibility was heavier than I had imagined. It wasn't just about leading a company, it was about leading a family, a legacy. I had to make decisions that would affect every single person in this company, and that terrified me. A knock on the door snapped me out of my reverie. I looked up to see Stanford Green, Grandpa's lawyer, standing in the doorway. He had the same calm, measured expression as always, but today his presence felt different. I could sense his unease. He knew the storm that was brewing. "Casey," he said, his voice steady, but I could hear the undertone of something else, something unsaid. "The board is waiting for you. They're ready to hear your vision." I nodded, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "I'll be there in a minute." As he left, I sat back in my chair, closing my eyes. I tried to steady my breathing to calm my racing heart. "You can do this. You have to do this." But as the words echoed in my mind, the doubt crept back in. What if I fail? What if they see through me? What if I'm not enough? The room felt too small, the air too thick. I couldn't breathe. I had built my entire life around proving I was capable of being something more than just the quiet daughter, the invisible one. But now I had to prove it all over again. Only this time there were no second chances. I pushed myself out of the chair, walking toward the conference room. With every step, I felt like I was walking to my own execution. The faces of the board members flashed in my mind, cold, calculating, and full of judgment. They didn't want me there. They didn't believe in me. And yet, I was walking into their domain, ready to fight for something I wasn't sure I even understood. I opened the door to the conference room, and all eyes turned to me. I walked to the head of the table, where Grandpa had sat before, and took my seat. The room was silent for a long moment, the air thick with unspoken tension. My father's eyes were narrowed, his face set in a mask of forced civility. Nate was sitting beside him, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The rest of the board members, people I had only heard of in passing, were watching me with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. "Casey," one of the board members began, his voice measured, almost condescending, "we're all eager to hear your plans for the future of this company. What direction do you envision taking us in?" I swallowed hard. I had prepared for this. I had spent countless hours thinking about the future, about how I could steer this ship through the storm. But now, under the weight of their gazes, I wasn't sure I could even speak. I felt like I was back in the classroom as a child, about to present a project to a room full of critical eyes, knowing I was bound to fail. I cleared my throat, pushing back the anxiety that threatened to suffocate me. I believe in the values this company was founded on," I started, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. "I believe in integrity, in building something that matters, not just for the bottom line, but for the people who depend on us." My voice cracked, and I felt the eyes of the board members piercing me. I quickly gathered myself, forcing the words out before I could think too much about them. "We need to refocus on what truly matters, I knew this was my moment, my defining moment. I could cower in fear or I could stand tall. The decision was mine. The company was mine, and I couldn't let it slip through my fingers. "We move forward," I said, my voice steady now, "together, or we fall apart. But I will not let us continue down a path that's only leading us to destruction. Not for the sake of pride, not for the sake of ego, but for the future of this company." I felt my heart pounding, the weight of my words sinking in. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about my legacy, the one I was building, the one that wasn't going to be defined by fear, not anymore. I waited for their response, my hands clenched tight under the table. I had made my stand. Now I could only hope they would see it. The silence in the boardroom was deafening. I had just taken the reins, and now it felt like the weight of an entire empire was hanging from my shoulders, threatening to crush me beneath its enormity. There were no celebratory cheers, no applause for my victory, just a stillness that settled like a blanket over everything. I had expected resistance from the board. I had expected skepticism. But what I hadn't anticipated was the fear that would follow me like a shadow, haunting me at every turn. What was supposed to be a fresh start felt more like a cage. The walls were closing in, and I was suffocating under the expectations of a legacy I was terrified I might not be able to live up to. As I walked back to my office, the echoes of their voices bounced around in my head. "Are you sure you're ready for this? What makes you think you're cut out for this job? You'll never measure up." They weren't just the words of the board, but of everyone who had ever doubted me. My father's dismissive attitude, my mother's half-hearted encouragement, Nate's constant snide remarks, all of it swirled in my mind. A constant reminder of how little I had ever been seen for who I truly was. I sank into my chair and stared at the papers in front of me. They blurred together. My thoughts were a mess, twisted with fear, doubt, and the paralyzing thought that maybe, just maybe, I had made a mistake. The phone on my desk rang, snapping me out of my reverie. I hesitated before answering. It was Stanford. "Casey," his voice came through tense. "We need to talk, now." The urgency in his tone made my stomach drop. My heart raced as I stood up, grabbing my jacket and heading out of the office. The hallways of the building felt eerily empty, and for a moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking to my own execution. When I reached the conference room, I saw Stanford standing by the table, his face grim. My chest tightened. Something was wrong. "Sit down," he said, his voice unusually soft. I did, my pulse pounding in my ears. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this, Casey," he began, his eyes locking with mine. "It's happening. Your father and Nate, they're trying to sabotage you." The room seemed to tilt beneath me. I blinked, disoriented, trying to process what he was saying. "What do you mean?" I whispered, my voice barely a murmur. "They've been working behind the scenes," Stanford continued, his voice growing more serious. "They've reached out to the executives, to board members. They've been planting seeds of doubt about your leadership. They've even started questioning your ability to manage the company. They're trying to pull strings to take back control." I felt the blood drain from my face. The words hit me like a physical blow. My father, Nate, the betrayal hit deeper than I could have imagined. After all the years I'd spent trying to prove myself, trying to be more than just a shadow, they were still trying to tear me down. "Stanford, are you sure?" The words were barely a whisper, but they carried all the weight of my doubt, of my fear. What if this was too much? What if I wasn't enough? "I'm certain," he said quietly, looking at me with a sympathy that made my skin crawl. "They're not going to give up easily. They'll use every dirty trick in the book to undermine you, and it's only going to get worse from here." I sat back in my chair, the walls of the room suddenly feeling as if they were closing in on me. I had trusted them. I had trusted my family. But now I was faced with the undeniable truth: they would never let me lead. I was nothing more than a placeholder, a token in their game. I thought back to the early days, growing up with Richard and Nate, always pushed aside, always second place. How could I have been so naive to think that this would be different? I had convinced myself that I was strong enough to handle this, that my determination would be enough to carry me through. But now, standing at the precipice, I wasn't so sure anymore. "Stanford." My voice cracked, and I hated myself for it. I hated the weakness I could feel creeping into my bones. "What do I do now?" Stanford's expression softened, and for a moment I saw something almost like pity in his eyes. "You fight. You hold your ground. You don't let them break you." I closed my eyes, taking a shaky breath. I had spent so much of my life trying to avoid conflict, trying to please everyone, trying to be the good daughter. But now I was faced with something far greater: the possibility of losing everything I had worked for. My vision for the company, my future, and my own sense of self-worth. What if they were right? What if I wasn't cut out for this? What if all my efforts were just a fleeting moment, destined to crumble beneath the weight of their opposition? "You don't have a choice anymore, Casey," Stanford continued, his voice firm, almost like a command. "You can't back down. Not now. You've already made your move. You've already taken control. Now you have to finish it." I nodded, but the gnawing fear in my stomach didn't dissipate. The fear that I wasn't enough, that I was in way over my head, that my father's words were right all along, that I was a failure waiting to happen. "You can do this," Stanford said again, more softly this time. "You have the strength, you have the vision. Don't let them steal that from you." I nodded again, this time more resolutely. I had to do this. For myself, for Grandpa, for the future of Thompson Enterprises. But as I stood up to leave, the uncertainty clawed at me once more. I could feel the walls closing in. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, and the pressure was suffocating. I walked back to my office, my mind a swirling storm of doubt and resolve. The battle had just begun, and I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to win. But I knew one thing: I couldn't walk away now. I had already made my stand. Now I had to fight for what I had built. The days leading up to the board meeting felt like a slow march toward my own reckoning. I had thought I was ready. I had convinced myself that all the years of doubt, all the years of proving myself to others, had prepared me for this moment. But as I sat in my office, staring at the papers in front of me, all I felt was the suffocating weight of everything I had yet to prove. The phone rang, snapping me from my thoughts. It was Stanford. His voice on the other end was strained, more urgent than usual. "Casey, it's time. They're ready to push you. This is the moment. You need to stand your ground, no matter what." His words were like cold water splashing across my face. For the first time in days, my heart raced not with anxiety, but with something that felt like resolve. I had made this decision. I had fought for this. The legacy of Thompson Enterprises was mine to shape, and now there was no turning back. "I'm not sure I can handle this," I whispered, though I hadn't meant to. "I know it's hard," Stanford replied, his voice steady, a calm in the storm. "But Casey, you've got everything you need. You've earned this." I hung up the phone and stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't feel ready. I didn't feel capable. But the truth was, I had already made my choice. And now I had to fight for it. The moment I walked into the boardroom, everything shifted. The air was thick with tension, and the cold stares of the board members felt like 1,000 daggers in my back. Richard's face was as stone-cold as always, his arms crossed in a defensive posture that told me everything I needed to know. Nate, too, had that familiar sneer, a reminder of everything I had fought to escape. And yet, there I was, standing at the head of the table, a seat I had fought my whole life to occupy. "Casey," Mr. Morris, the chairman, began, his voice as cold as his gaze, "we've reviewed your plan, and we're not convinced it's the right direction. The company needs a leader with more experience. You're young, and let's be honest, this company isn't a place to learn on the job. Each word felt like a punch, each phrase pushing me closer to the edge. You're not qualified. You're not enough. The echoes of my father's disapproval from years past crashed into my chest. But this time, something was different. I was different. I wasn't going to shrink back. Not again. I understand your concerns, I said, my voice steady but trembling with the weight of the moment. But this company isn't just about making money, it's about making an impact. We've been stuck in the past, and I am the one who's ready to take us into the future. I have the vision, and I'm asking for your trust. I'm asking for the chance to prove it. For a brief moment, the room fell silent. The board members exchanged looks, their expressions unreadable. My father was the first to speak, his voice tight with disdain. "You're out of your depth," he said. "This isn't about vision, Casey. This is about power. You can't just walk in and take what you've never earned." The weight of his words hit me like a physical blow, but I refused to let it show. I had spent too many years waiting for his approval. I had spent too many years trying to make him proud. But this was my moment. And if he couldn't see me for what I was, then that was his loss, not mine. "I've earned this," I said, my voice rising. "I've worked harder than any of you realize. I didn't grow up with privilege like you did, Richard. I didn't inherit my success. I built it from the ground up. And now, I'm not asking for your approval. I'm telling you that this company is mine to lead, and I will not back down." The room was still. The air crackled with the tension that had been building for years. My father's face twisted with rage, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of him. I wasn't afraid of any of them. The only fear I had now was the fear of failing myself. "I'm not asking for permission," I continued, my voice shaking but strong. "I'm telling you that I will not let this company fall into the hands of those who only care about power and money. We have a chance to rebuild this from the ground up, and I will fight for it, whether you stand with me or against me." Stanford stepped forward, his presence a calming influence amidst the storm that was brewing. "The trust is irrevocable," he said firmly. "The transition has already begun, and unless you can provide us with a legal reason to stop this, Casey is in charge now." Richard's face turned white with fury, and for a moment I thought he might strike out at me. But then he took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and turned away, walking out of the room without another word. Nate followed behind him, his eyes burning with something darker than anger. The room remained silent, the air heavy with unspoken words. I could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on me, but I didn't falter. Not this time. When the door closed behind them, I was alone in the room with Stanford. He looked at me with something like admiration. "You did it, Casey," he said quietly. "You stood your ground." But I couldn't celebrate, not yet. The storm was